Hey everyone, ready to dive into some really fascinating stuff. It's all about those split-second decisions, those gut feelings we have, like thinking without thinking. We're really digging into Malcolm Gladwell's Blink.
Blink. The power of thinking without thinking. Yeah.
That's the one. I gotta say, this book, it really makes you think twice about how intuition works, doesn't it?
It really does. It's amazing like how much our brains are processing without us even realizing it, you
Yeah.
know? Gladwell, he calls this thin slicing.
Thin slicing.
Yeah, thin slicing is like our brain takes just a tiny sliver of information and makes these like shockingly accurate judgments.
Huh. So it's like our brains are always in the background,
Hmm.
gathering data, even when we're not paying attention.
Exactly, precisely.
Yeah.
And Gladwell, he tells this really fascinating story about the Getty Koros.
The Getty Koros.
Yes, this ancient Greek statue. And the Getty Museum, they paid a fortune for it, millions. They did every test imaginable, talked to the top art historians, and everyone, I mean everyone, was convinced it was the real deal.
Okay, so they thought they had a genuine ancient Greek statue on their hands. What happened?
So then they bring in a few more experts, right?
Yeah.
And some of these experts, they just took one look
Mhm.
and like instantly sensed something was wrong.
Really? Just from a glance, they could tell it was a fake?
Well, I mean, these experts, they'd spent their whole lives, years and years, surrounded by ancient art. So they had, without even realizing it, trained their minds to spot these tiny details. Like almost like how a chef can tell if a cake is baked perfectly just by the smell, you know?
I get it, yeah. So what was it about this statue? What did they notice?
Well, in the case of the Getty Koros, a bunch of them zeroed in on the fingernails.
Yeah.
They just looked, well, too perfect, too new for a statue that old, you know?
Wow. Talk about attention to detail. It really makes you wonder what other things, what cues we're missing in everyday life just because we haven't trained our brains to see them. You know what I mean?
Absolutely, absolutely. And you know what's really wild about that story? One of the experts, this super renowned art historian,
Hmm.
when she saw the statue, she just kind of sighed and said, I'm sorry to hear that.
I'm sorry to hear that. What did she mean by that?
She just knew.
Yeah.
She couldn't exactly explain why at that moment, but her gut, her instinct, it just screamed fake. And guess what?
Don't leave me hanging.
She was right. The statue was a fake.
No way. That's
Yeah.
incredible. It's like our gut feeling is sometimes way ahead of like our conscious thoughts.
Exactly, exactly. That story just shows how powerful expertise can be when it's combined with our unconscious abilities, that thin slicing. It really makes you stop and think about all the times maybe we ignore a gut feeling when it might actually be our unconscious mind picking up on something important.
Right. So it's not just about blindly trusting any old gut feeling. It's more like recognizing that those feelings, they're often based on years of experiences, patterns we've picked up on, even if we can't explain it right away.
Exactly. And to show this even more, Gladwell talks about this psychologist, John Gottman. He says he can predict if a couple will get divorced.
Wait, seriously, he can predict divorce.
Yeah. And with like crazy accuracy, just by watching them argue for a few minutes.
No way. Just a few minutes. Okay, I gotta know. How does he do that?
So Gottman, he videotapes couples in his lab. He analyzes everything, every little interaction. But he's not just listening to what they're saying. He's watching those super quick facial expressions, those micro expressions.
Micro expressions.
Yeah, they happen so fast we don't even realize it, but they betray our real emotions. And he analyzes their tone of voice, body language, all of it.
So it's like he's like a human lie detector, but for relationships.
Huh. In a way, yeah, I guess you could say that. He's found that couples who consistently show these patterns, he calls them the four horsemen of the apocalypse.
Four horsemen of the apocalypse. Sounds intense.
Yeah, it is. During arguments, things like criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. Couples who do those are way more likely to end up divorced.
Those are some pretty heavy patterns.
Yeah, they can be really toxic for a relationship. And often people don't even realize they're doing it until it's too late.
So you're telling me, even in something as complex as a marriage, there are these hidden patterns, these tells, and our unconscious minds can pick up on them.
Precisely. But, and this is where it gets even more interesting, Gladwell says that even though our brains are great at making these quick judgments, we often struggle to explain why we make them.
So it's like you get a bad feeling about something, but you can't exactly put your finger on why.
Yes, exactly that. Gladwell, he calls this the locked door of the unconscious.
The locked door of the unconscious. Okay, I kind of like the sound of that.
Right. It's like, think about how we don't consciously control our heartbeat or our breathing. It just happens. And a lot of our thinking, those quick judgments, happen below the surface too.
So then how do we know? How do we know when those gut feelings they're right and when we should maybe like second guess ourselves?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? It's like, do I trust my gut or do I need to like overthink everything?
Huh.
And Gladwell, he actually explores this with this really interesting experiment involves ropes.
Ropes. Okay, tell me more about this rope experiment.
So they ask people to solve this problem. They have these two ropes hanging from the ceiling, but they're too far apart to just reach one from the other. And the goal is to tie the two ropes together.
Ah, okay, so how do you do it?
So here's the thing. In the room, there's also like all these random objects, right? Like a chair, some tools. There's even a toolbox like open on the floor.
Okay, I feel like that
But-
toolbox is going to be important.
Yeah, you got it. So the solution is to tie the toolbox to one of the ropes, set it swinging, and then you can catch it when it swings towards the other rope, and boom, you can tie them together.
Oh, that's clever. I admit, I don't know if I would have thought of that.
It's a good one. But here's the really interesting part. A lot of people, they figure this out, like unconsciously, But when you ask them to explain how they did it,
What happens?
they make stuff up. Like, completely invent these logical explanations. They might be like, oh, I moved the chair closer, even though they didn't even touch the chair.
That's wild. So their conscious mind is trying to play catch up and make sense of a decision their unconscious mind already made.
Exactly. It's like our brains, they crave a narrative. They want an explanation, even if it's totally made up.
Yeah, like we don't want to seem clueless even to ourselves, right?
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. And Gladwell calls this the storytelling problem. But of course, there's another side to this whole thing, right?
What's that?
Well, our snap judgments, sometimes they can be wrong. Like, really wrong.
Yeah, that makes sense. We've all made those kinds of mistakes.
Right, and they can be influenced by these biases we have, even if we don't realize it. And sometimes these snap judgments, they can lead us to make, like, unfair or even harmful decisions. Gladwell, he calls this the Warren Harding error.
The Warren Harding error.
Yeah, Warren Harding, he was a U.S. president.
Oh, yeah, right.
Mhm.
Wasn't he like considered one of the worst presidents ever?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
And, a lot of historians think he got elected based almost entirely on how he looked.
Seriously.
Yeah, like he was a very handsome dude,
Yeah.
tall, distinguished looking.
So people basically voted for him because he looked like what they thought a president should look like.
Pretty much. His campaign manager even said Harding just looked the part, even though, his qualifications were, let's just say, questionable.
Wow. It's kind of scary how easily we can be swayed by something as simple as someone's appearance.
It really is. And you see this Warren Harding error
Yep.
everywhere. Like, there are way more tall men in CEO positions.
Wait, what? Taller CEOs? Really?
Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah.
But studies show it. Like, on average, taller men are more likely to be CEOs.
Huh. I
Right.
never really thought about it before, but yeah, that actually makes sense.
Yeah, and research suggests it's not a coincidence.
Yeah.
It's this unconscious bias we have that links height with, leadership qualities.
Wow, so even without realizing it, we might be more likely to see a tall person as a leader. That's kind of wild when you think about it.
It is. And these biases can be even more, insidious when you think about things like race and gender, right?
Yeah.
They can lead to, subtle or even really obvious discrimination.
So if these biases are unconscious, how do we fight them? How do you fix something you don't even realize you're doing?
That's the million-dollar question, right? Well, Gladwell, he says just being aware of these biases, that's a good first step, just knowing they're there.
Mm.
And he also says it's important to create systems and structures that can help reduce these biases.
Systems. Okay, I see where you're going with this.
Like in the classical music world, for example. They started doing these blind auditions.
Blind auditions. What's that?
So the musicians, they perform behind a screen. That way the judges, they can't see them, they just hear the music.
Oh, interesting. So it takes away the bias, like whether the musician is a man or a woman or what they look like.
Exactly. And it's made a huge difference. Like, way more women are being hired into orchestras now.
Yeah, that's great. So by removing that visual element, the judges can focus more on the actual talent, not their unconscious biases.
Exactly. It levels the playing field,
Right.
and it makes the evaluations more objective.
That's awesome. So, okay, we've talked about the power of these snap judgments, right? The unconscious mind, how it works, but also the potential downsides, the biases that come into play. It seems like we need to find a balance. Like, when do we trust our gut and when do we slow down and, really think things through?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. And Gladwell, his whole point isn't that we should ignore our intuition. It's more about, understanding how it works, the good and the bad. He's all about finding that balance between careful, thought-out decisions and trusting our gut.
So it's not one or the other. It's more like a both and kind of thing.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
It's like, think about it like this. Gladwell talks about this really fascinating military exercise called Millennium Challenge O2.
Millennium Challenge O2. Okay, what was that?
So this retired Marine Corps General, Paul Van Riper, he's tasked with playing the role of like a rogue Middle Eastern commander in this big, elaborate war game.
Oh, wow. A war game. This sounds serious.
It was no joke. The Pentagon spent something like $250 million on this thing just to test their fancy new high-tech approach to warfare.
So like using technology to gather intelligence and stuff like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Their whole thing was to use all this data and technology to outsmart the enemy.
So did it work?
Well, their team is called Blue Team. Van Riper's team was Red Team. And Blue Team, they had all the latest gadgets, computers, algorithms, the whole 9 yards, right? But Van Riper, he decided to go old school. He was like, I'm relying on my gut, my experience.
Wait, so they had all the technology and he had, what, just his instincts?
Pretty much. And guess what? Van Riper, he absolutely crushed them.
No way. He beat all that fancy technology with his gut.
He did. He used all these unconventional tactics. Like,
Right.
instead of using, radios and stuff that could be intercepted, he sent messages by motorcycle couriers. Can you believe that?
Wow, old school.
Right. He even launched a surprise attack that, like, decimated their fleet. It was a total disaster for Blue Team.
Wow, they were probably pretty embarrassed, huh?
I'm sure. But it just goes to show, in the real world, in the chaos of war, data can only take you so far.
Hmm.
You got to be able to adapt, think on your feet, trust your gut.
So in that case, all that overthinking, all that data, it actually worked against them.
Exactly. And it applies to so many things in life, like Gladwell. He talks about this example from Cook County Hospital in Chicago. They were having all these problems accurately diagnosing patients coming to the ER with chest pains.
So many things, so much data. It sounds like they had too much information to process. It was overwhelming them, even the experienced doctors.
That's exactly it. Information overload, too many symptoms, test results, medical histories. It was just too much to handle. So this cardiologist, Lee Goldman, he steps in.
Okay, so what'd he do?
He creates this really straightforward algorithm, just a simple set of rules based on a few key
A
things.
few key things. Okay, like what?
The patient's EKG, how they described their pain, and whether or not they were sweating.
So instead of trying to process everything, he found the most important factors and just focused on those.
Exactly. Cut through the noise,
Yeah.
and the results, they were amazing.
The algorithm, it worked.
It worked like a charm. Way more accurate in diagnosing chest pains, even better than a lot of doctors using their own judgment.
Yeah. Wow. So sometimes less is more, I guess, huh? Like by simplifying the decisions, the outcomes actually got better. Makes you wonder, what other areas of life were overcomplicating.
Right, totally. And Gladwell, he brings up this other fascinating concept. It's this idea that sometimes when we really start analyzing our preferences, breaking them down, it can backfire on us.
Really? How so?
So he calls it Kenna's dilemma.
Kenna's dilemma. Who's Kenna?
Kenna, he's a musician, really talented guy. But, for some reason, his music, it just wasn't catching on with the general public.
Oh, okay. I think I've heard of him. What kind of music does he play?
Kind of hard to define, really. But that was part of the problem, I think. So anyway, they did all this market research,
Yeah.
played his music for these focus groups, all that. And the response,
What, they hated it?
no, not hated it,
Yeah.
but it wasn't like a hit, kind of lukewarm. But here's the thing.
What?
People in the music industry, the ones who really knew music, they loved his stuff. It was the people who were, overanalyzing it, trying to figure it out. They just didn't connect with it.
It's like that whole thing, those who can, do. Those who can't, teach. Right? Like the people experiencing the music firsthand, they got it. But the ones picking it apart, overthinking it, they missed something.
Yes, that's a great way to put it. And Gladwell, he uses the Pepsi challenge as an example of this.
The Pepsi challenge, like the taste test thing.
Yeah, so in blind taste tests, people usually choose Pepsi over Coke, right?
Yeah.
But when you add in branding, the marketing, Coke usually wins.
That's so true. It's like you might actually prefer the taste of one thing, but then a catchy jingle or a cool commercial, it totally sways you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it goes back to what we were saying about the unconscious, right? It's like we can overthink things, talk ourselves out of liking something we actually enjoy.
So how do we know when to trust our gut and when we need to, think things through more? Especially with those unconscious biases always lurking in the background, waiting to trip us up.
Ah, the million-dollar question. And, Gladwell, he doesn't have a simple answer for that. But he does give us a lot to think about. He talks about what he calls the delicate art of mind reading.
Mind reading. Hold on, are we talking about actual telepathy now?
Huh, not quite. But it can feel like that sometimes, right? Like we're constantly picking up on these subtle cues from other people.
Yeah, like their facial expressions, their body language, even their tone of voice, right?
Exactly. We use all those things to figure out what other people are thinking, what they're feeling.
So we're all like amateur mind readers in a way.
I think so, yeah. And, to show just how complicated this whole thing is, Gladwell, he talks about this really tragic case, Amadou Diallo.
Amadou Diallo. That name does sound familiar.
He was an unarmed man who was shot and killed by police officers in New York City.
Oh, right. I remember that case. It was all over the news. So sad.
It was a tragedy.
Mm-hmm.
And what Gladwell points out is that the officers, they were under so much pressure, right? In that moment, they kind of experienced this temporary mind blindness.
Mind blindness. What do you mean by that?
Like they completely misread Diallo's intentions. He was scared, confused, but they saw aggression.
Wow. So their snap judgments in that high stress situation, they had these horrific consequences. It really makes you think about how easily we can misinterpret things, especially under pressure.
Exactly. And,
Yeah.
Gladwell, he doesn't shy away from those tough topics. And at the end of Blink, it's not like he has this simple, happy answer. But he does leave you with this sense of, like, cautious optimism.
Hmm.
He says that, yeah, snap judgments, they can be really powerful, and sometimes they can lead us astray. But we can learn to be more aware of those biases.
So it's about working with our intuition, not just blindly following it or trying to shut it down completely.
Exactly. We've got to understand it, know its limitations.
It's like anything else, right? The more we understand something, the better we can use it.
Right.
Well, this has been a fascinating dive into thinking without thinking. Thanks for taking us through it.
My pleasure. Always happy to talk about this stuff.
For everyone listening, we hope this has given you a lot to think about, maybe even a new perspective on how your own mind works. Until next time, stay curious.